Welcome to the Great Sources Season 2, Episode 4. Season 2 is dedicated to the question of whether we should live in Eretz Yisrael. So tonight we're going to continue the discussion of the Sholosh Shavuos. First, a summary and a quick review of last week's shir. So we have this Gemara in Ksubis that talks about Hashem being Mashbi'ah b'nei Yisrael, making us swear not to be Ola B'choyma, not to ascend to Eretz Yisrael B'choyma, which Rashi says means Yachad B'yad Chazaka, together by force, not to be Moirid in the Umis, and not to be Doichik the Kates, and various other Shavuos. There are 6 in some counts, 4 in other counts. Basically, you could say it's under one umbrella term about Shavuos against engaging in Messianic activities, meaning doing things that are eventually our eventual destiny to be redeemed, but pushing and pushing for those kinds of things to happen before it is time. That's how you could say it in a nutshell. And we spoke this on Midrashim about this and talk about there were times when this actually was done, was transgressed, specifically in the days of Bar Kochba, and the Gemara says terrible things will result if we transgress these Shavuos, and those terrible things are, as the Gemara puts it, Hashem is going to be matir the basar of Bnei Yisrael ketzavos u'cheles hasada. He will make Jewish blood hefker like wild animals for the hunt. So that's very severe. And what we discussed last week is that, so if you want to know if you should live in Eretz Yisrael, you might be concerned that perhaps it's dechikas akates, or perhaps if we have a state, and suggesting that everyone should go, it might be aliyah b'choyma, things like that. So before we know how to apply this Gemara, we have to understand, well, what exactly is this Gemara, as we discussed last week? What are we talking about? Are we talking about a formal Isser in the Torah that we have to follow as law? Or are we perhaps talking about something else? The Avnei Nezer and the Satmarav Zatzal both understand in different ways, but understand that the Shavuos are something formal that it's important to define on its own terms. The Avnei Nezer understands it to be a Shavuot to the Neshamis, Ayin Sham and Yeridea. The Satmarav understands that it reflects Kfira, that underpins us engaging in actions that will bring the Geula. Satmarav Shita on this matter is something we're going to get back to another time. What exactly the Kfira is and what his opinion is about redeeming ourselves, so to speak, to say it extremely. But the point that we're focusing now is that he derives this, that's the name of one of his Sfarim, is the Maimer Sholosh Shavuos. He derives this from this Gemara, and he understands that this is why it's so severe. The reason why the Shavuos are so severe is because they involve a certain Kfira. This is what he develops in the Sefer Maimer Sholosh Shavuos. What we discussed last week is that there's often a Rambam in Igeres Taimon. The Rambam says very clearly that the matter of these Shavuos, it's not a matter of halacha, not a matter of kfir, it's a matter of danger. And what the Gemara means to teach us, means to impress upon us, is the grave danger, the grave risk, the great risks that we take if we rebel against the nations, if we try to retake Eretz Yisrael. That's what the Gemara is all about. And the reason why the Gemara says that if Chas Hashem B'nei Yisrael over the Shavuos, Hashem is going to be matir their basar, like wild animals, is not a punishment in the traditional sense of, let's say, you did an Aveira. You did an Aveira, but the Aveira is you endangered yourself, and what's going to result is the natural result. So basically the idea is like this, and someone asked me to explain, and so I want to just clarify this a little bit. One of the listeners asked me to explain, okay, so this is mere military advice that the Gemara is giving us. Anytime you undertake a military campaign, if it doesn't succeed, there's going to be repercussions. So, for example, we talked about Bar Kochba. Bar Kochba was brutally repressed. Ultimately, the revolt was brutally repressed by the Romans, and that was an instance of being over the Shavuot. So, of course, the Romans didn't take kindly to the Jews rebelling, and they repressed the revolt. What does that have to do with the Gemara? What does that have to do with the Shavuot? Why do Chazal have to teach us this? So I want to just clarify that a little more what the Nikud is. And this is actually something we're going to get a little more into this in the next year, because next year we're going to figure out now that we did figure out what the Shavuos do mean, how to apply them. But just to give you a sense, this is not merely military advice. This is telling us, Bnei Yisrael, that our position in the world is a very tenuous position, a very dangerous and perilous position. Because since we do have a great destiny, and we are the chosen people, the more we push that future in the face of the nations of the world, the more we're running a risk of provoking them. So it's not merely subjects who rebel against their lords and risk them repressing the rebellion, but there's always the risk that the nations of the world won't take kindly to us acting like the chosen people and doing things that involve a certain destiny of world control, which is what an element, at least, of Mashiach. So the point is, when it's not the time for that, the world is not going to take kindly to this. So it's not just a matter of military. It's saying the whole place of the Jews in exile is a very problematic. The Jewish problem is real. The Hainu, the world cannot exactly accept the Jews so simply, and this Gemara is all about how to not provoke them in the wrong way. More on that next week. Like I said, we're going to discuss other things in the Gemara that have to do with this idea about the Jews knowing their place in the world and how to work out this relationship of Jew and Gentile. And also next week we're going to discuss how this is not just the military advice, but this is actually halachic matter, and tells us that when we're approaching the questions that regarding Eretz Yisrael and the like, we're supposed to take into consideration these far-ranging kinds of cheshbainis, which are not necessarily halachic in other circumstances. But more on that next week. I don't want to focus on that point now. I want to focus tonight on one thing. I'm going to show how the idea that it says in the Igeres Taimon in the Rambam, that the idea of the Shavuos are a matter of danger, and the Gemaras are pressing, the Gemara and the Midrashim, and the various places where these things are quoted are meant to impress upon us what grave risks we run by being Jews and by pushing the Jewish dominion narrative on the world before its time. So that point that's made in the Igeres Taimon, I'm going to show you tonight how it's really clear also in Hilchos Malachim in the Rambam, and how it's miyashiv the whole Gemara in Ksubis very clearly. And once you get this Igeres Taimon, it's the key to unlocking all the problems in the Gemara Ksubis, which has engaged in the Satmar Rambam and others. But the Igeres Taimon solves everything, and it's very clear to me 100% that this is what's happening in the Gemara Ksubis. I would like to mention that I am very surprised, and I don't know what to make of this, that in the V'yoyel Moshe, in the Maimer Shalosh Shavuos, in the introduction, he quotes this Igeres Taimon. He quotes it for a different point over there, which is to say, he wants to make the point that even if the attempt to rebel doesn't succeed, it's still considered transgressing the Shvuah, because the Rambam warns against these attempts at these false messiahs. So he says, you see from the Rambam that even if it doesn't succeed, but he quotes the Rambam on the very first page of V'yoyel Moshe. It's there. Sorry, right? It's right there. And he quotes it. And he quotes the Lashon Rambam, B'shvil sheyoda Shlomo, because Shlomo knew, therefore he was mashpia, which, as we discussed last week, indicates that it's Shlomo predicting the future and trying to warn us against the dangers. So Adon Satmarov actually quotes the Rambam on page number 1 of the book, and doesn't take it to its logical conclusion, which is that this is not a matter of kfira, this is not a matter of isser, it's a matter of sakana, is something that I don't understand. Okay, but on to the subject of tonight's discussion, which is, I would like to show you how this idea that the matter of the oaths is a matter of danger, not a matter of halacha, can be made very clear. Firstly, as we mentioned last week, Satmarov asks, how come the Rambam doesn't bring this in Mishneh Torah? How come he doesn't bring this in his halacha sefer? Well, the answer is, as the Rambam says in the Igeres Taimon, it's not halacha. It's deep truths about the nature of the status of Yisrael and the Amim, and how tenuous and perilous that status is, and how if the Jews don't know their place and do things that indicate to the world that they don't know their place, meaning during Golus, then they're in big trouble. They're going to suffer tremendously. And we're going to get to that, again, like I said, we're going to get to that next week, and how it actually relates. It does relate to the Holocaust, but in a different way than the Satmarov said. But what I'd like to show you now, so that's, first of all, that's why the Rambam doesn't bring it in in Hilchos, in Mishneh Torah, because it's a non-halachic thing. It's a statement about reality, about the nature of the world. It's about sociology, about destiny, and understanding Hashem's plan for the Jewish people and how problematic that is for the world. To digest before they're ready, before we're ready, and before we can explain it properly so that it's palatable and everyone understands how they fit into that, etc., things like that. So it's like pushing the Mashiach narrative. Before it's time, you get protocols of Elders of Zion. You get the world believing that we're out to have world dominion just because we're greedy, etc., things like that. But like I said, more on that next week. The point is, it obviously doesn't belong in Mishneh Torah. That's number one. But what I'm going to show you now is also further in Hilchos Malachim. We can show that in Hilchos Malachim, where the Rambam does deal with the Gemara and Ksubis about moving from Bavel, living in Eretz Yisrael, and the Isser to leave Bavel. We can prove from Hilchos Malachim that the Rambam in Mishneh Torah understood the Gemara Ksubis as he understood it in Igeres Teiman, which is that it's a matter of danger, not halacha. So here's how it goes. And this is also going to make the whole sugya in Ksubis very clear. So we have the Gemara in Ksubis that begins that Rav Yehuda said for a person to go from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, anyone who goes from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael is over ba'aseh. Shenemar, Bavela yuva'u v'shama yeyu. Pasuk says they should be brought to Bavel and remain there ad yoim pakti osam, no Hashem, until the day that I remember them, says Hashem. So they must be brought to Bavel or remain there, this pasuk in Yirmiyah, until Hashem remembers them. So therefore you can't come back from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. And to remind you, Reb Zera said that pasuk is talking about klei sharis. That pasuk is not talking about people. It's talking about the kelim. The pasuk says that the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash that weren't taken away when Yechanya was exiled will eventually be all taken to Bavel, where they will remain until Hashem remembers them. So it says nothing about the people. It says Reb Yehuda, yeah, but it says Shpatiyas. Shpatiyas, and we have the Shvua. And Reb Zera says the Shvua is not about an individual. The Shvua is that we shouldn't go up b'chayma, all of us together, or by force. And Reb Yehuda says, well, it says Ishbati another time, so that tells us it's like a ribui. It tells us how important Ishbati is, how important this is that it even includes a yachid. So then the obvious question, and that's how the Gemara ends basically. So the obvious question is, wait a second. Rabbi Yehuda started off and said, "Kol ha'olami bavel eretz Yisrael over ba'aseh shenever bavel yuvau." So why does he start off with this pasuk bavel yuvau if ultimately it's all about the shavua to go to Eretz Yisrael? Additionally, which is how, by the way, Rabbi Yehuda is brought in other places in Shas. It's quoted as Amar Rabbi Yehuda Kol ha'olami bavel eretz Yisrael over ba'aseh shenever bavel yuvau. But isn't it that pasuk is about klei sharis? And ultimately, Rabbi Yehuda is about a shavua. So why did Rabbi Yehuda say Kol ha'olami bavel eretz Yisrael over b'shavua shenever Shabati eschem? Additionally, the shavua has nothing to do with Bavel. If Rabbi Yehuda holds that the Shavua prohibits any individual from going back to Eretz Yisrael, then why did he say Kol ha'olami bavel eretz Yisrael over ba'aseh? He should have said Kol ha'olami eretz Yisrael over ba'aseh. Okay? Now, before we get to solving this all, according to the Rambam, saying that the Rambam is the key to the sugi, before we get to that, I just want to point out, in the Rambam's understanding, which, like I said last week, I find no one that argues on meaning from the Rishonim until this not Rav and Eliezer. And their understanding that the issue, the warning against going to Eretz Yisrael is a warning against risks that one might be incurring by pushing the redemption, so to speak. So let's understand Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says even an individual can't go. Now, why is an individual running a risk? If an individual moves to Eretz Yisrael, is that something that's going to provoke the nation? So the answer is very simple. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, the Torah, the Psukim really are very strict about Shpat, right? They keep on repeating it, which means this is something we have to be really, really careful about. And given that if everyone does it, it will provoke the nations, I don't even want an individual to do it. Even an individual, this is something we have to be so careful to avoid any possibility of doing something that's going to lead to a danger, because this is the worst danger in the world for the Jewish people, is that they should provoke the nations and put our destiny in their face when it's not yet time. So even an individual can't do it, which makes perfect sense. while parenthetically, if the shavuos are something else, like let's say it's kfira to believe we can bring our own geula, things like that, then it's really hard to explain how an individual going to Eretz Yisrael would be risking some sort of kfira. Additionally, the pasuk is don't be ma'or ava ad shetachbatz. Why would an individual moving to Eretz Yisrael be considered being ma'or Hashem's love? He's not trying to bring the whole redemption. It's pretty schwer. According to the Rambam, it makes perfect sense. Since for the whole Jewish people to move to Eretz Yisrael or to rebel, that would be a provocation. So Rabbi Yehuda doesn't even want an individual to do it. That makes sense. Okay, but now back to the questions. Okay, so that's the questions. Rabbi Yehuda starts off and then ultimately it seems to be a shvua. If it's a shvua, why does he say the pasuk of Bavel Yiva'u? Why does he say? And what does that have to do with Bavel if ultimately it's a shvua? Okay, now there's another point which is going to be clear from the Rambam. The Gemara in Ksubis, besides Rabbi Yehuda's statement about Kol Olam Bavel Eretz Yisrael Eiger Basei Shinem Bavel Yiva'u, later in Ksubis, Anaf Kofir Aleph, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, Kishem she'asa lotis me'eretz Yisrael leBavel, kach asa lotis miBavel l'shar ratzis. Just like it's also to leave Eretz Yisrael to go to Bavel, it's also to leave Bavel to go to Shar ratzis. Bavel is a special place. Now, one would think that the reason why you shouldn't leave Bavel, the reason why if you're living in Bavel you're not supposed to leave Bavel, is not because of Bavel Yiva'u v'Shabayu. Because remember, Bavel Yiva'u, that pasuk, is talking about Kli Sharis. Okay? And yet the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, Seif Peril, the Rambam brings this halacha. Kishem she'asalotzes me'oretz l'chutz oretz, kach asalotzes miBavel l'shar ratzis, shenemar bavelo yuva'u v'shamayihu. Wow. But isn't that pasuk talking about Kli Sharis? And the Lechem Mishneh asks Akash, he says, I don't understand. Rabbi Yehuda said, Kol Olam Bavel Eretz Yisrael Eiver Basei Shenem Bavelo Yiva'u. But here it's Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, talking about Shar Ratzis, meaning going from Babel to anywhere in the world. So if the reason why you're not allowed to go from Babel to anywhere in the world is because of Bavel Yiva'u v'Shamayihu, so why does Rabbi Yehuda earlier say Kol Olam Bavel Eretz Yisrael Eiver Basei if you're not allowed to leave Babel to go anywhere else? Okay, so I want to explain what's going on over here in the Shittas Rambam. Shittas Rambam, remember, the Rambam says clearly that the reason why Yehuda Omer Shmuel says you're not allowed to leave Bavel and go to Shai Ratzis is because Bavel Yiva'u v'Shamayihu. The pasuk it says they should remain in Bavel, which remember the Gemara says, and if you look it up in Yirmiyah, it's explicit. Nothing to talk about. The pasuk is not talking about people; it's talking about the Kalim of the Mikdash should be brought to Bavel and remain there. And yet the Rambam brings that pasuk to say that we Jews should not leave Bavel. And then that's the first Gemara, again, where Yehuda said that a Jew cannot leave from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. There the Gemara has to fall back on the Shvuos. What's going on? Is it the pasuk of Bavel Yiva'u v'Shamayihu, which actually is really by Kli Sharis, or is it the Shvuos? How does it all come together? Here's what we're ready to understand this sugya perfectly and answer all the questions that come up in this Gemara. Very simply, based on this Yesod that we have in the Geras Table, that the idea of the Shvuos is there's danger. Here's how. The Gemara starts off and says the following. Okay, you have this pasuk in Yirmiyah that says Bavel Yiva'u v'Shamayihu. They should be brought to Bavel and stay there. They is not referring to people. It's referring to the Kalim of the Mikdash. Okay. If it was referring to people, then it would be an explicit pasuk saying, people, stay there until Hashem recalls you. There will be nothing to talk about. But it's not. It's actually talking about the Kalim of the Mikdash, right? Okay. So what's the pasuk saying? Let's think about that. The pasuk is saying the Kalim of the Mikdash will be brought to Bavel, where they will remain until the day that I, Hashem, recall them. So, okay, well think about that. If the pasuk says that the Kalim of the Mikdash are going to be brought specifically to one place in the world, Bavel, where they're going to remain until Hashem recalls them, brings them back to the Mikdash, that suggests that Bavel is a special place, or that gives Bavel something specially Jewish. The Kalim of the Mikdash are there. And the fact is that we find in numerous places in Chazal. If you have this source sheet over here, I'm looking at now sources 6, 7, 8, and 9. Numerous places in Chazal where they consider Bavel to be a very special place. You have this Gemara in Pesachim, where the Gemara talks about why Bavel is special. Why is it the good place for the Jews to be? You have this Tanchuma in Noach, very important Tanchuma, which we're probably going to get to another time. Tanchuma in Noach Siman Gimel, which says that Bavel is the place to be, and the Jews, meaning the place for Jews to be in Galus, and that throughout Bayis Rishon, many Jews remained behind in Galus Bavel. I'm sorry, throughout Bayis Sheni. Throughout Bayis Sheni, they didn't return. Many of them stayed behind. They stayed in Bavel, where they were safe from the Gzeras, Edom, Yavan. They were safe from Shmad, and they are going to be safe in Bavel until Mashiach comes. It says in Tanchum over there that Bavel is the safe haven for the Jews. It's a safe place for the Jews. And the Gemara in Pesachim, in Ksubas Daf Kufir Aleph says, living in Bavel is like living in Tzor Shnema Hoyt Tzion Himoti Yeshevas Bas Bavel. Escape to Tzion if you're in Bavel. And the next Gemara says, Amar Abaya Naktinon Bavel Lechaz Yechev LeMashiach. In Bavel they won't see Chev LeMashiach, which once you see the Tanchuma, you understand that doesn't mean that, okay, there's going to be Gog and Magog and Bavel's going to be spared. Bavel will be spared from all Gzeros. The Jews in Bavel are the safest in the world. They will not have Gzeros Shmad, they will not have Yavan, Edom, nor Yemais Mashiach. So what's my point? And then you have this Gemara in Megillah about the Shchinas in Bavel, and which shul in Bavel has the Shchina in it, and the Gemara describes stories of people actually experiencing the Shchina. So my point is that Chazal understood Bavel as being a really very important place for the Jews. Okay. Where does it say that Bavel was chosen? What about Bavel was chosen? Well, we have this pasuk that says, Hashem tells us that the kingdom of his Mikdash will be in Bavel. We brought to Bavel and remained there until the day he recalls them. So I want you to imagine. Let's say there was a pasuk that says that the Kalim of the Mikdash are going to be brought to New York City, to the museum, where they will remain until the day that Hashem recalls them back to Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash. So it would be a very sensible thing to say, okay, this is the place where Hashem keeps his Kalim, and we, who are Jews and faithful to Hashem and awaiting Hashem's redemption, should stay here with Hashem's Kalim. We shouldn't leave New York and go to Chicago. We should be faithful to Hashem and be like his Kalim, which he's being mafkid, which he's putting away as a Pekadon in New York. Imagine. We should stay there with it and be faithful and show that we haven't forgotten them and we're waiting along with his Kalim. Okay, so then the point is that when the Gemara says, you have this pasuk about Kalim of the Mikdash, Baveli Yuva'u V'Shama Yiyu. Yes, the pasuk is talking about Kalim. But it's very appropriate for us to be there in Bavel with the Kalim until Hashem recalls his Kalim and us with them. Because you see, there's this whole theology about Bavel, which is that it's safe from Shmad. It's the safe place. Hashem says, I'm putting my Kalim there, where they will remain safe and sound until the day that I recall them to my Mikdash. So too, we have these sources in Chazal that Bavel is the right place for the Jews. So too, that's the key point. In other words, it goes together. The fact that Bavel is the right place for Jews to be is because it's rooted in the fact that Hashem said, Bavel is the place where I am keeping my Kalim until the day of redemption. All we need to do is stay there in Bavel until the day of redemption. When Hashem remembers his Kalim, he's going to remember us too, and Bavel is safe from Chev LeMashiach. Which is an amazing thing, by the way, if you think about it, because the Tanchuma says Bavel is a safe place for the Jews, which means literally, that had all Jewry remained in Iraq, Bavel, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. That is the place where it's safe. To be Jewish, and there's not going to be Shemad, not going to be Xeris. That's literally what it means. So the point is, when we learn something, you have to imagine things being different than they actually are. But we have to have the counterfactual. Let's say history would be different. And by the way, the history of how Jews ended up other places besides Bavel is murky. Did they leave Bavel? The Jews, let's say in Europe, were they originally in Bavel? Were they exiled first from Bayis Rishon to places in Europe, etc., or Bayis Sheni? It's very murky. But still, that doesn't take away from the fact that the point is what the Gemara is telling us, that something special about Bavel, which is rooted in the fact that it's the place of Hashem's Kalim. And if it's Hashem's Kalim, the place of Hashem's Kalim, where Hashem keeps his Kalim until the day that he recalls them, then all we have to do is, what's incumbent upon us to do is to be there along with his Kalim, in that place where Hashem says, okay, time out. It's like a timeout. Bavel's a timeout. Going to Bavel, timeout, I'll call you when I'm ready. Meaning I'll call the Kalim when I'm ready. Stay with the Kalim, you'll be safe. That's the appropriate place for a Jew to be. Don't leave Bavel, which is the place where Hashem keeps his Kalim. And don't leave Bavel and go to some other place in Chutz La'aretz. It's appropriate for you to be in Bavel along, together with the Kalim that Hashem is keeping there until the day that he recalls them. That is the idea. And that's why the Rambam says, it's also lots in Bavel Shar Aratzis Shenem B'Beveli Yivo Shamayu. Yes, the pasuk is talking about Kalim, but if the Torah says, if the pasuk says that the Kalim are going to be dafka in Bavel until the day Hashem recalls them, then it is only appropriate that the Jews should be there in Bavel too. Now let's get to Rabbi Yehuda. Well, what if a person wants to leave Bavel to go to Greece? Bad idea. Stay in Bavel with the Kalim. Well, what if you want to leave Bavel to go to Eretz Yisrael? Bavel is a special place because Hashem keeps his Kalim there. Bavel is a special place because the Shechina was gathered to Bavel. Bavel is a special place for all the reasons that the Gemara says in Pesachim. But Eretz Yisrael is also special, right? So if you're going to Eretz Yisrael, and I'll give you an example just to bring out the point. The Medrash Tehillim says, Rabbi Yossi Mechalafta told the son of Yishmael, this is there on number 10, he told him, you want to see the face of the Shechina in this world? Have a asoik b'Torah be'Eretz Yisrael. Shenemar dirshu Hashem v'uzay bakshu fanav tamid. Beautiful drasha. Dirshu Hashem v'uzay bakshu fanav tamid. Constantly seek Hashem's face. Where? Dirshu Hashem v'uzay go seek him in Eretz Yisrael. So if you want to, and Oz is Torah. So if you want to see the Shechina in Olam Hazeh, the face of the Shechina, here's what you got to do: learn Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Okay. So someone's in Bavel, like Reb Zera, right? He's in Bavel, and Bavel is an important place to be because Hashem's Kalim are there, and you should be there along with Hashem's Kalim. That's spiritually, that's the right place to be, or religiously, which is maybe is the right word. That's how we demonstrate our loyalty to Hashem. While the Shechina is in Galus, we stay there with his Kalim, with the Shechina that's in Bavel. But what about going to Eretz Yisrael? Wouldn't that supersede this need, or this, what makes it important to be in Bavel? Because Hashem's Kalim are there. Bavel is a special place. But if I can go to Eretz Yisrael and see the Shechina in Eretz Yisrael, of course I should do that, right? Of course that's better than being in Bavel. So here's where Rabbi Yehuda comes in. Here's where the Shvuas comes in. It says Rabbi Yehuda like this. There's a Shvuah. The Shvuah is, don't provoke the nations by pushing Geula. So, if you want to leave Bavel and go to Eretz Yisrael, what you're saying is, Bavel, the Kalim, it's okay. I have something better in Eretz Yisrael. Oh, wait, that was I don't want you to do anything that's going to indicate clearly that you have something better in Eretz Yisrael than you have in Bavel, because right now we have to keep a low profile. So therefore, if someone goes from Shar Aratzis to Eretz Yisrael, Rav Yehuda has no issue with that. Even according to Rav Yehuda, the Hishbati is on the individual. That doesn't mean that an individual can't move to Israel like he might move to anywhere else, even though he happens to be Jewish. It's if it's an individual Jew who leaves Bavel and goes to Eretz Yisrael, that is a statement that Eretz Yisrael has something more than Bavel has to offer. So we say to this Jew, the Jew who's moving from Bavel to Israel, people are going to say to him, well, why are you leaving behind the Kalim of the Mikdash that are in Bavel and the Shechina that's in Galus and Bavel? And he's going to say, oh, because I could do even more. I could see the Shechina B'Olam Hazeh in Eretz Yisrael. That is provocative and that is dangerous. So I want to put together how that answers all the questions here. Rav Yehuda starts with Kol Ha'olam Bavel Eretz Yisrael Over Ba'aseh. But isn't it a Shvuah? No, it's not a Shvuah. Shvuah is not an Isser. The Shvuah is indicating danger. Okay. Well, if Rav Yehuda holds that even an individual is dangerous, even for an individual to go to Eretz Yisrael, what does that have to do with Bavel? The answer is, it's not dangerous for an individual to go to Eretz Yisrael. It's dangerous for an individual to go to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel. Why? Because since Bavel Yuva'u V'Shamayu is a reason that everyone should be in Bavel, the only reason a Jew would leave Bavel and go to Eretz Yisrael is because Eretz Yisrael offers him something more than Bavel does. And if Eretz Yisrael offers more than Bavel does, and you make that clear, then you're being provocative. So if you say, because I want to go to Eretz Yisrael because the Jews had a nice history in Eretz Yisrael. Back in the day, we had Nevi'im there, and our forefathers and our grandfathers are buried there, etc. Fine, great, no problem. But if you're going to leave Bavel and go to Eretz Yisrael, Bavel, where the Kelim of the Beis HaMikdash are currently waiting to be redeemed in 1,000 years, whenever they're going to be redeemed. So then you're going back, then by going back, you're saying that I can actually do better right now. I have something living in Eretz Yisrael. I have the Shekhinah in Eretz Yisrael. That's something that is a message which we have to keep secret. We don't want to make that message clear. So the Lechem Mishnah asks that Rabbi Yehuda, if you're not allowed to leave Bavel and go to other countries, why does Rabbi Yehuda say Eretz Yisrael? The answer is Rabbi Yehuda's adding. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, one cannot leave Bavel and go to other countries. That's because the Kelim are in Bavel until Hashem recalls them, and we should be there too. Rabbi Yehuda himself says, therefore, I extend that and say you can't even go to Eretz Yisrael. You can't even go to Eretz Yisrael. Whether Shmuel holds that, that's your decision, perhaps we'll get to that another time, but Rabbi Yehuda is saying you can't even go to Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because if you go to Eretz Yisrael over Bavel, if you say that Eretz Yisrael is preferable to Bavel, you're basically saying that Eretz Yisrael is Geula kind of place, a Shechina kind of place. And that's not something that you can be pushing. That's not a narrative that you can be promoting to the Romans or whatever powers that happen to be. Okay, so that's really interesting. Now I want to tell you something else. So we have Reb Zera, really interesting. The Gemara gives us some very interesting information about Reb Zera. Reb Zera actually did go to Israel because he says, no, there's no Shvati on an individual. I'm just going as an individual. I'm not going as a Yachad B'Yed Chazaka. So it's okay for me to go. It's safe. The Gemara tells us in Brachos Daf Mem Zayin. The Gemara says something very interesting. That's the parak about dreams. The Gemara says if a person sees barley in a dream, that means that he's free from sin. Why? Because the pasuk says, "V'sar avoincha, v'chatascha techupar," and "Sa'irim sar." Okay. Says Reb Zera, I didn't go up to Eretz Yisrael until I saw barley in a dream. Reb Zera wouldn't go to Eretz Yisrael until he had this barley dream, and that indicated to him that he is free from sin. So, some people learn from this. Some Rav learns from there. Okay. So what does that mean? Does that mean that a person shouldn't go to Eretz Yisrael unless he's a tzaddik gomer? So that's what the Satmar Rav says, and this is a doctrine that Satmar Rav has, which we're going to get to at some point. This whole shita that the Satmar Rav has a shita basically in short. I'm going to say it in short because we're going to get to another time. It's like this: God has His plan. People are supposed to be in Gullus. Don't think that Gullus doesn't have a purpose. People are supposed to be in Gullus. People are supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael too. Jews. We don't know who's supposed to be in Gullus, who's supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael. So we trust. How do you know who's supposed to be? Who's supposed to be in Gullus and be Masakin, the Tikkun, and the purpose of Gullus, and who's supposed to be in it. So we don't know. So we trust that if a person is Mechav L'Shem Shemayim, so Hashem, who's making the Tzaddik Gover, he makes people go on the right path, he will be Madrich that person in the right path. Reb Zera needed an indication that he belongs in Eretz Yisrael. Something like that. But the truth is, I think it's much simpler. And we can't. And the Satmar Rav is very important to the Satmar Rav that Gemara because he believes if someone's not a tzaddik, he shouldn't be in Eretz Yisrael, and that Gemara indicates that. Reb Zera needed a sign from heaven that he belongs there. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that this has to do with Reb Zera and Reb Yehuda, and here's why. Remember, you're not allowed to leave Bavel to go to any country, but you might be allowed to leave Bavel to go to Eretz Yisrael. Why? Why might you be allowed to leave Bavel? Everyone's supposed to be in Bavel with the Shechina and Gullus. Why would you be allowed to leave Bavel and go to Eretz Yisrael? Because you can do better than Bavel. If you can't do better than Bavel, that means your connection with Hashem, which is expressed through being in the Makam of the Kelim. The Shechina is in Gullus and Bavel, and the Shechina is in a Beis HaKnesses in Bavel. Like the Gemara says in Megillah, there was a certain shul where certain Amoraim experienced Gilui Shechina, but they experienced the Shechina in Gullus. That's a different thing. Shechina in Gullus is different than Shechina in Eretz Yisrael, and these things mean some things very specific, which we don't have to go into now, but these just sounds like a lot of words, but actually is a lot of meaning. You can have access to the Shechina in Bavel. Should you go to Eretz Yisrael? Yes, if you can do better than having a Shechina in Gullus. Now, who can do better? Meaning, who can access the Shechina that's in Eretz Yisrael? A tzaddik gomer, someone who has no sins, doesn't belong in Gullus. He would never have gone. If everyone would be like Reb Zera, then we would be in Eretz Yisrael to begin with, because Reb Zera was free from sin. So we had to see barley in a dream, because if he's a chayte, if he's a sinner, then who says he can do better than the Shechina in Gullus? Then he should be in Bavel, because he's not going to do better by going to Eretz Yisrael. He needs to have this kind of Shechina that's a Gullus kind of Shechina, with the Kelim are, the Kelim of the Mikdash that are mufked over there. So it's Dafka Reb Zera who went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, despite the shita of his Rebbe, the name of Shmuel, that one cannot leave Bavel and go to other countries because all Jews should be in Bavel, with the Shechina that's in Galus. He says, I can do better than the Shechina in Galus. Why? Because I'm a Tzaddik Gomer, and the Gemara says, by the way, call a Shoreb Eretz Yisrael, Shoreb Le'ovin, which means that Eretz Yisrael is for non-sin. Hopefully we'll get to that one day, what that's all about. So Reb Zera, when he saw that he was free from sin, that's when he knew that he was on a Madrega, that he can get something more in Eretz Yisrael than he has in Bavel, and that's why he's ready to move. So, the point is, Leonenu, that now that we understand what the Shavuos are all about, and now that we understand the Sugi very well, we can also explain why this very interesting biographical information about Reb Zera that he didn't go to Israel until he knew, had an indication that he is free from sin. So that's how it all comes together. I want to bring now one more proof that to the Shita, the Rambam, not the Shita, this idea, which, like I said, I would say, anyone argues, that the Shavuos are about danger. The Rambam says Nechz Malach in Peril Aleph. The Rambam talks about Mashiach in those Prakim Peril Aleph and Peril Beis, and he says Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles to prove that he's Mashiach, which is something that fools stupid people say, Tipshim Omer. Not the case, says the Rambam. Because Rebbe Kiva was a Chacham Gadol Mechachmei HaMishnah, and he was the arms bearer of Ben Kuziva, is another word for Bar Kochba. V'hu haya omer alav shu melech Mashiach. He said that Bar Kochba was King Mashiach. V'dimahu v'kol chachmei doire shu melech Mashiach. Rebbe Kiva and all the sages of his generation imagined that Bar Kochba was the Mashiach until he was killed. Once he was killed, they knew he's not Mashiach. The Rambam continues and says, this is in 13. The Rambam continues and says, so how does it work then? Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. So what happens? He says, if there's a king from Beis David, learning Torah and Isaac and mitzvahs like David, and forces Yisrael to follow the Torah, and to be mechazik the cracks in the Torah, and he wages the words of Hashem, Harezeh becheskas shehu Mashiach. He is becheskas Mashiach. If he succeeds, and he vanquishes all the nations, and he builds the Mikdash, and brings back Nitchei Yisrael, Harezeh Mashiach bevadai. Then he is certainly Mashiach. If he doesn't succeed or he was killed, then we know that he's not the Mashiach, and he's just Malchei Beis David. He's just like a good king from Beis David, but not the Mashiach. So the Rambam is saying like this: Bar Kochba didn't do a miracle, because ultimately he was killed. He wasn't the Mashiach. And yet Rebbe Kiva and all the Chacham believed that he was Mashiach. Why? Because there's a halacha. Mashiach is a halacha. How do you determine someone's halacha is Mashiach? How do you determine if someone's Mashiach? Halacha. If you have a king from Beis David meets certain criteria, then he's Becheskes Mashiach. You should support his project. He's a good king. If he succeeds, great. If not, he's just a good king. Okay, now you remember the Medrash in Shir Hashirim says that one of the generations that was over the Shvuah was the generation of Bar Kochba. And the reason why they were treated so harshly, the reason why they suffered as much as they did, that we get millions of people, I don't know how many people were killed, Jews, is because they were over the Shvuah. Now, they didn't do anything wrong. The way the Rambam puts it, they followed the halacha. Rebbe Kiva and all the Chachamim were not avaryanim. They followed the halacha. The halacha is, if there's a king from Beis David who does certain activities, and is mechazik the Torah, and wages the battles of Hashem, he's becheskes Mashiach. So their support for the Bar Kochba rebellion project was a halachic support. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do an aveira chas v'shalom. Certainly wasn't kfira. So then, and yet they were not punished. They suffered because they were over the shvuah. Now, how could you suffer for being over a shvuah if you didn't do an aveira? The answer is, it's not an aveira. It's a mitzias. It's a mitzias. Any messianic attempt is something of the gravest danger. It doesn't mean we can't do it. And on the contrary, we have to do it because there's rules about when to do it. If there's a king from Beis David, he's becheskes Mashiach, and so there's rules about these risks also. But the consequences are not contingent on there being a sin, because you can do everything as the halacha dictates, and there's still going to be these consequences, this backlash, if it's actually not Mashiach. So that's the bottom line. But you know, you have to think about this. If you look at the Gemara Ksubis, the biggest proof is that the Shavuos are background information in the Gemara Ksubis. The Gemara starts, Amar Yehuda Kala Olam Yibavel Eretz Yisrael Over Ba'asei Shnem Baveli Yavo. Okay, isn't that pasuk like Isharis? No, there's the Shavuot. But like I was explaining, or even without the specific way I was explaining, you look at the Gemara and you see the Shavuos are never brought up as a prescriptive thing. The Shavuos are used to buttress the Baveli Yavo V'Shamayu. So to then take that Shavuos and make that the center of the focus as an independent halachic affair is really not, it doesn't have the basis in the Gemara. That's the biggest raya, that the Gemara, in the Gemara there's no mention of the Shavuos being a formal Isser. They're just used to back up Rav Yehuda. I think the way I was explaining it works out perfectly. Again, just to summarize, Bavel is a good place to be because the Kalim are there, but that's only one factor. If you can do better by going to Eretz Yisrael and get the Shekhinah in Eretz Yisrael, that's something that of course is better than being in Bavel. Rav Yehuda says, I don't want you to push that. And the halacha, according to Moses, is not like Rav Yehuda, by the way. You could go from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, but that shouldn't concern us here. That's all for now. Next week, I'd like to bring some other proofs to this idea because it's really so important, and there are some other great rayas, a few other great rayas, if I remember, to this idea that the Shavuos are about danger. I want to also bring you some sources that say this. I'm not trying to appeal to authority in these shurim because, like we decided in the introductory shit, there's a lot of authorities, but it happen to be some really interesting sources that actually say this explicitly. Later sources, achreinim. So we'll link some sources, and then of course we'll discuss, really important, this I think will be next year also. So now that we know what the Shavuos are all about, so now how do we apply the message today? What dangers might lie in wait for us if we move to Eretz Yisrael, and is it something dangerous? How should we think about Eretz Yisrael in light of this understanding of the Shavuos? That, in Mitzvah Shem, will be next week.